Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's session. Just give me 1 second while I share my screen so that you can see it. Okay, so for today's session, it is how to use semantic references, which we oftentimes in-house refer to as SPT. And John's going to go over exactly what that means in just a little bit. But it's really exciting that we are able to talk about this release and show you how to make your life so much easier by making use of SPT.
So as Barrett mentioned, we are going to be going through a really exciting new feature that we've been working on recently called Semantic References. As Barrett also mentioned, we do call this SPT for short. You'll see why as we go through the presentation today. What I'm going to be presenting today is to start with going through the current challenges that we have with the existing smart control methods and implementations that are available. It's really important to understand where we're coming from in order to understand why it was designed the way it was, and then some of the benefits that we'll talk about later. After we go through those current challenges, we will then introduce what semantic references are. I know that term can sound kind of fancy, but once you see the actual implementation, it's very, very straightforward. Really, the entire point of SPT, of semantic references, is to make your lives as form builders as easy as possible, and even honestly as a form administrator. So we'll go through what semantic references are, we'll talk about the benefits of SPT, and then I do have a small working example to show you how to implement this. And then it's not on the agenda slide, but I do have a set of what I would call recommended practices for us as we exit the webinar. Because it's such a new feature and because we're not fully sure exactly how it will end up affecting the entire iForm customer base, I don't want to go ahead and call them best practices. But we're learning as well as you are, and in our experiences so far, these are some of the recommended practices that I have for groups who are going to begin implementing SPT in their own forms. So to start off, let's go through some of the current challenges that you have with smart controls in their existing form. And when I was going through and reviewing this for the webinar, I broke this down into 4 primary categories. The first category here is caching, and we did a webinar on caching a few months ago. This has been kind of top of mind in our development and our review, talking to customers. This topic comes up over and over again. And so it was really front and center of us trying to figure out a way to make things better for everyone. If you're not familiar with caching, it's essentially a scenario where when you enter data into a record or into a form, when you either open up a new record, so you close one, start a new one, or maybe you go from one record to another record that are saved on the device, you will end up in a situation where data from the previous record is loaded into the current record, feeling like it has cached, like it's stuck there. I go into a more in-depth explanation in that previous webinar, but just for the purposes of today, to preface the topic at a high level, essentially, if you use standalone references, meaning only the element name, then that will lead to caching. And the reason that happens is because every time you start a new record or you open up a new record, that data is actually stored in 2 separate places behind the scenes. There is first going to be a spot where it is stored, which is what we call kind of the full form path or the full object. And then the other place it is stored is in these standalone free-floating variables. But the challenge is that whenever you start a new record, the free-floating variables are not cleared or managed in any way. Only that large full object is refreshed. And so what'll happen is when you start a new record, for example, the full object is cleared, everything is blanked out and empty, but those standalone references still carry the values from before. Now, if you've been with us for a long time, I'm sure you've done things like set dynamic values equal to an empty string, maybe an option-based element to a -1. We called these cache busting techniques, and they were essentially a workaround for your forms to clear those standalone values whenever a new element would load or a new record would load. There are some trade-offs with doing it this way, but essentially with SPT and semantic references, we are going to eliminate really the caching issues. The second challenge of the current smart controls is complexity. So If you've ever done a simple calculation in a form, if both elements are on the parent, the references are not too bad. You use your parent form name, dot, and then the element name. And so you can have a relatively small reference for a relatively simple calculation. The challenge comes into play when you start doing calculations on subforms and kind of within the nested structure of the iForm platform. Because then what happens is, while the logical complexity of what you're trying to accomplish stays the same, adding two numbers together, for example, the reference complexity starts to increase exponentially to the point where you have these really long references in like a third or fourth layer subform that if you test your form out and you don't get the result you're expecting, it's really difficult to troubleshoot. And so we wanted to make sure that the complexity of the business logic matched the complexity of the implementation that would have to be required on the iForm side. I can tell you right now, SPT is not going to solve literally every single form building challenge you will have. It's going to cover, in my probably like 95, 99% of them. You're still going to have those fringe cases where you want to, grab a value from the grandparent before the current record, something like that. And in those scenarios, SPT is not going to be enough to get that done. But we also felt that those scenarios, the logical complexity was substantial enough that the reference complexity matched it. And so that's that second challenge of complexity. The third challenge here is traceability. And so what I mean by this is, if you have an element, again, just the element name, and if you haven't looked at that form in a long time, you're not really sure where that element exists. It could be on that same level, and then in all fairness, a lot of the times it is. But it's also just as likely that that element could be on a parent level, maybe two parent levels up. And it's very challenging when you come into a form that you either have never seen before or you haven't looked at in a really long time, to look at a smart control, a dynamic value or condition value, and really get the full context of what that statement is trying to articulate. And so we wanted to make sure that the references provided some sort of context to the form builder, so that when they look at it, whether it's for the first time or it's been a while, they're able to read that and get a snapshot into what the expectation, the intention is of the statement. And then the final challenge here is portability. This is a smaller set of the challenges that we kind of observed with smart controls over the years, but it is definitely something that is substantial, especially when you start talking about groups who have larger enterprise level deployments where you have many, many forms. Oftentimes what those groups will do is they will create standard starter forms. And the problem with using the full form path when you start the reference with your form name is that as soon as that form name changes, your references are now broken. And so what we found was that in users' experiences, this would make form package import a more arduous process than it was ever intended to be, because you would have to import the form, change the form name, and then go through and change every single smart control. And we wanted to reconcile that experience. We wanted to make the form builders' lives easier and better. And so we wanted to make sure that portability issue was addressed as well. And so when we start using semantic references, what you'll be able to see is that if you take a form package and you import it, you change the form name, either of those things, the references will still be persistent without any of the other issues such as caching, complexity, and traceability. So what are semantic references? To start off, let me break that term apart a little bit. So semantic essentially means that it has to do with language and understanding. And then the references portion has to do with the data that you're trying to point to or that you're trying to pull from. And so the goal of semantic references was to provide a simple, accurate, direct way of having relative references. What that means is the prefix that you use for the reference should provide some context. The data should always be accurate, meaning no caching. It should be direct, meaning when you read it, it is a short reference. And then finally, it should be relative, meaning that you can move it to different forms or even change the structure of the form and have your references persist as long as they're still appropriate. And so with those 4 challenges of smart controls came these 4 design pillars. Now, in order to accommodate this, and in order to hit 95, 99% of the smart control references in a concise, compact, contextual way, what we've done is we've implemented 3 relative references, and these are our semantic references. So instead of starting your smart control with the form name, now what you can do is start the reference with the word self, with the word parent, or with the word top. And I have the letters capitalized here on the slide, but if you actually do this in the form builder, everything should be lowercase. And the reason we chose these 3 keywords is because if you think about any given view, so that means you're in your iForm app, you're on a form, you're filling out a record. That record has exactly one self, its own current view. It can only have exactly one parent, meaning the record that is directly above it, and then it can only have one topmost record. So in the scenario where you have maybe a form that has 5 levels of subforms deep, there will only be one eventual topmost record. Because of that one-to-one relationship, as the form builder, as the app itself, and in terms of processing the logic, you're able to know with certainty what you're pointing to or what you're referencing. And so if I say self dot first name, whether I am at the topmost level or I'm in a 5-level subform, I know that that reference means look within the current view, the current form, and find the element called first name. Similarly, if you use the parent keyword, you will know to look 1 level up. And if you use the top keyword, you will know to look all the way to the top of the object structure. Now, what's really cool about this actually is the references get shorter, but in terms of the reliability, the accessibility, and the consistency, the truth is what we did was we used the full form path structure, and we simply said, hey, these 3 words, self, parent, and top, as you navigate through the form, point to these different places within the object structure. And so using the full form path versus using SPT will yield identical results. And I know that for form builders, as you're making changes to your form, especially if your form is very complex, there's that level of nervousness, like you want to make sure that the outcomes are going to stay the same. And so because of the way we implemented that, we can guarantee that the results will be the same using full form path versus using SPT. Now, the results using the standalone references versus SPT will naturally not be the same. And in fact, we don't want them to be the same because those free floating variables or the standalone variables are what was causing the caching issues. Those were what were causing some of those data discrepancies or having a lack of context that you would see in your references. And so what we did was, the goal was to keep the references short, as close to the standalone references as possible, with the accuracy, the reliability, the consistency of using the full form path. So SPT really sits in the middle of those 2 current existing implementation options. Barrett, I'm going to pause here for a second. I just kind of downloaded a whole bunch of information on the audience. Have there been any questions asked up to this point, or is there anything that I can clarify?
There was a question, but I know you're going to talk about it in a few minutes. So let's just go ahead and continue as you go through this. And if they need more clarification as you go through it, then I'll interrupt you and let you know.
Beautiful. Sounds great. All right. So we talked about the challenges for smart controls and their current implementation. We talked about what semantic references are and some of the design goals around them. And now you've seen how we've implemented them. So what are some of the benefits that you can expect from using SPT? Well, the benefits are really directly tied to the design goals, which stem from the challenges. The biggest benefit of SPT, in our opinion, is that it's reliable. As I mentioned, you will get the consistency of using the full form path. You won't have any caching issues. You will know exactly what your data is meant to be, and it will be consistent. The other big benefit of SPT, and this was something that we heard immediately as we started to talk to customers about this when we were thinking about how we wanted to structure this feature, is an aspect of training and bringing on more people to the organization or to your iForm implementation. One of the stories that I heard kind of over and over again were stories from large organizations where you had a single form builder or maybe two form builders. But essentially what that was really getting to at the heart of it was that there was an apprehension around having new people come into this form building role because the existing form builders knew that the forms were built a certain way, and in order to continue to design correctly, you had to know, all of these different behaviors, and you had to learn how to do those full form references. They were intimidating. But because SPT is so straightforward, it's really going to benefit training, whether you're a brand new form builder in a new iFormBuilder account, or if you are a long time form builder and are looking to bring somebody on to help with the form building. Training on a new team member is going to be tremendously easier with SPT. The third benefit here is going to be focused on troubleshooting. And this was actually something that we pointed out, or that was identified by our internal team. Our support team is phenomenal when it comes to customers bringing questions about why this form isn't working the way I expected it to, or I want to make this certain change and I'm not sure if this is going to work how I hope it will. And while they do a great job of that, the reality is it takes quite a while to open the form package, to get a good contextual understanding of what that form is meant to do. And part of that is reading the references and knowing where to look within the form structure for each of the different pieces of the puzzle. Troubleshooting will become significantly easier with SPT because when you look at a reference and you see the word self, you know with certainty that element is in the current form that you're looking at. Similarly, if you see the word parent or you see the word top, using that form dependencies button in the form builder will give you exactly where you need to go to find the reference for that element. And so getting a snapshot at a single smart control reference, seeing these keywords SPT is going to get you so much further down the line in terms of the troubleshooting process than you would normally have to manually get to. This kind of goes hand in hand with readability. Again, if you've ever had the experience of building out a complicated form, deploying that form into production, and then 6 months later, you've got to make a form change and you come back and look at it and you're not really exactly sure what everything was anymore, SPT is really going to help with readability. So part of it is the context, knowing where to go for each of the references, but there's another very kind of functional benefit here, and that's simply that the references are shorter. I know that in the past we have done webinars, we've done trainings, we've done actual implementation support for customers with complex forms, and you'll see references where a single element is like literally 200 characters. And so by having these more concise, compact references with SPT, it's literally going to be easier to read whatever you have inside of your smart control fields. And then finally, the last benefit here that we've identified is the ability to have modularity in your form design. Now, this manifests in two different ways. The first way that you're going to be able to have a more modular form design ties back to what I mentioned as one of the initial challenges, which is portability. Because SPT don't have the form name in the reference, you can rename your form to your heart's content. You can import a form package and not have to worry about updating the references. So in that sense, a form package that you have, like a standard form that you want to deploy, all the references are now modular, right? You can take them, make changes to the outer container, and it's not going to impact any of those actual smart controls. The other way modularity comes into play here, though, and this is actually probably something that the groups with more complex forms may pick up on right away, but if you have more streamlined forms, may not be evident as easily, is the ability to do two things. One, have a form that functions as both the parent and the subform. And then the second one is to have subforms that are connected to multiple parents. And both of those things were challenging or were limiting with your full form path. And so let's say you have a form where you have a parent level and then a subform. The subform, sometimes you want to just assign the individual ticket to a user, and you don't want to send the whole parent with all of the records. Having those smart control references was really challenging before, because what you would need to do is using the full form path to function as a subform, those references don't work when you access the record directly as its own standalone record, it then being the parent. But if the calculations are in the same level, now you can use the keyword self, and whether that self is a standalone parent, or that self is a subform, a child record, or even if it is buried down multiple levels deep as a great-grandchild record, it doesn't matter. The reference still knows to look within the current view and grab the correct elements. Similar challenge, kind of different flavor. If you've ever wanted to use a smart control, or not a smart control, a subform with two different parents, and you needed to do smart controls with it, it was challenging because you used the full form path. It starts with the form name. Which form name do you use? Now, there were workarounds to that where you can say, hey, if the parent form name is this, use this reference. If the parent form name is this other value, use that reference. But then we go back to that challenge of complexity where your business logic is simple, but the implementation complexity starts to grow exponentially, and we didn't want that. But now that won't be the case anymore. And so you can have a form, and as long as everything is self-contained within that view, use the self keyword. And again, it doesn't matter if it has multiple parents, it doesn't matter if it's parent or child, the references will still function as we want them to. All right, so what I'm gonna do now is take us through a form that I built to start out with, and then I'll show you how we would implement some of these keywords. What I built here, and I have a small diagram just to show everyone what the form looks like at a high level, and then I'll go into the form builder and get more into the weeds with everything. But we have a 3-level subform where the first level of this building inspection form is going to have the elements for first name, last name, date, location, building, and rooms. Rooms being a subform. So you think about doing an inspection of a building, you go there, you specify the location, you specify the name of the building, and then you go into the inspection, and you're going to be going room to room. As I go room to room, I want to note what floor I'm on to help if you have to go back later, and then the description, and then the room itself, whether it's a number or it's, you could even change this to being a drop-down menu or a pick list. But inside that room, as you do your inspection, you may find issues. And so we have this 3rd-level subform where we can log issues. Each issue is going to have a description, what's wrong, a corrective action, how to fix it, and then any images that you need to support the documentation process. Also in that 3rd level, we have this field job number. And what this is going to be is an automatically generated job ID so that as an administrator, you can go through, export this form or this record for the 3rd level and have a list of all the job IDs without needing the information from the first 2 levels. And this reference is actually going to pull from both the parent or the top level, the parent level, and then from its own index as well. And so with this form structure, we're going to be doing 2 form building implementations. We're going to be starting with adding in a full name field on the parent level. And so this is going to give us an example of using the self keyword. And then the second reference we're going to be building is using the top keyword, the parent keyword, to do the job number or the unique job ID. And this is going to be in the format building, room, and then index. And so an index is just going to be the spot in order of the subforms. Indexes always start with the number 0 and they increment in whole numbers. So 0, 1, 2, 3 if you had 4 issues. If you only had 1 issue, the index would be a 0. But what we want to do is create a unique job ID. So we'll use the index to ensure that's the case. So in my form builder here, I have the parent form, I have the subform, and I have the child form. And what we're going to do first is add an element under first and last name for the full name. We will do this with using a read-only element, and we will say full name. And down here in the dynamic values, again, instead of using something like building inspection dot first name, which would normally reference this element here, we're going to be able to use the keyword self.firstname. So within the current view, use the word self, and it will point to that element. Now the next thing we're going to do, and this is the same for whether you used a full form path or not, but we're going to concatenate or kind of glue on, add to the first name, a blank space, and then we will add to that self.last name. So it'll be first name, space, last name. And if we, again, had used the full form path, this would look something like building inspection dot last name. But again, this is not portable. And because it's on the parent level, it's not too complicated. But if this was on a subform level, it would be increasingly complex. Another option we would have had is just doing the element name by itself. But this now would introduce caching. And also, if this field had not been on this current level, it would be challenging to find it within the form structure. So self.firstname plus an empty space plus self.lastname gives us this full name smart control. I'm gonna go ahead and save this. Let me see what happened here. I think my element got added to, where did it go? Do it one more time. So we have self.firstname plus empty space plus self.lastname. Save. Still not saving. Oh, it's there. Okay. Might be going crazy. All right. So in the subform, no changes that we need to make here, but do note that we're going to take this room element and use this as part of our job ID. All right, we're going to grab this value from the parent level, building name, and then we're going to use this value, room, and then finally the index of the subform within the issues subform here. So now on my grandchild level, let me do a quick refresh first. We're going to populate the dynamic value for this job ID, which you can see is a read-only element. Now, what we're going to do is we want to take the building name first. And so our reference is going to be to the topmost form. The element is called building name. And I just want to verify we have this text element, building name is there. From that, we will concatenate a hyphen, just a dash, to separate them. And the next thing we're going to add is the room. And so this is on the parent level from where I currently am, parent.room. And then finally, this last reference, we'll also separate with a hyphen, but this last reference is going to be that index value, 0, 1, 2, 3. Now, this one's a little tricky because you're not going to use self, even though this record, itself has an index. What we're going to be actually doing is referencing the parent subform to retrieve the current index. And so this reference is going to look like parent dot the subform name, which is issues, dot index. So this should give me something that looks like, I'll do this in the description. Let's call the building Robinson, and then the room B102, and then an index 0, right? Or 1 or 2 or 3 as you add more issues to it. And so we're able to build out this unique job ID that spans multiple levels of a complex form structure, and the overall reference doesn't even take a second line here. So it's very concise, very compact. Again, it's readable. I know where to go for each of these references, and it's reliable because we are essentially using the data structure that the full form path uses. So let me go ahead and save this. Barrett, I'm going to try to connect my phone one more time so I can show what this form looks like. Give me a second while I do that. But during that time, are there any questions that I could answer or clarify?
Yeah, we actually have, I've answered some of the questions, but there's two that I think I want to bring up to you.
Sure.
One of them is the question on, like, what do I do to start using SPT? Do I have to make any updates, or is it already available to me?
Great question. So SPT was released in the most recent iOS and Android releases. And what's really great about that is the way we released it, you still have the old methods as well, right? And so you can still use your standalone references, you can still use your full form path, and now this is just a new mechanism to build out your references. It is important that your end users have that version though, because otherwise it won't be supported. And so what I recommend all customers do is before you implement SPT, to make sure that you have all of your users updating to the newest version on iOS and Android. You can confirm that by looking in the licenses tab as well.
Okay, so I hear you, and I think that's great. Anybody who's on this call who has a white label, you may want to talk to your customer success manager and get the latest version of the white label so you can start accessing. The other question that came in is, you kind of answered it already, but they asked, will the old ways of doing things stop working at some point? Do we have to update all our old forms to use references? What does it look like?
Yeah, so currently all three methods will work, and they will all work kind of in nice harmony together. I will say that knowing the standalone references provide, or not provide, but the standalone references cause some data integrity issues. We would like to phase out the standalone references if possible at some point in time. It's not necessarily the references that we want to move away from, but we just want to make sure that we can guarantee accurate, reliable data for all of our users without them having to remember some of these nuances with the behavior of the software. But for now, all three of them can be used concurrently. So if you have a whole bunch of forms, you're able to make changes to a couple of them, let the other ones run the way they will, and have this distribution.
Great. And then there was another question, and it seems like, from what I understand with this question, they need a little bit more clarification on what you're actually referencing when you say parent. They were wondering if it's the name of the first subform, but I know you can clarify that a little bit more.
Sure. So when I say parent, let me actually go back to that image I had. What we mean is the form that sits above my current view. So if I'm on this subform here, the third level, where I'm filling in the description of the issue, the corrective actions, and taking pictures, my parent is this form here, the one that's right above it. So normally we would have to use the actual form's name again, but we don't want to do that because it's not portable, it's not modular, references get very long. Hence, the parent term is a relative reference. It doesn't point to a specific form, it just points to the form relative to my current location. I hope that clears it up.
I think so, and I'll let you know if it doesn't.
Okay, perfect.
That's,
All right, go ahead.
I said that's it for now.
Awesome. So I was able to get my phone working here. I wanted to show what this form looks like real quick. So I'm going to go into the building inspection, and real quickly, I kind of glossed over this because I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to get the form to work. But first name and last name are, oh, I need to sync the device. First name and last name are auto-populated with built-in functions. I also have the date auto-populated using the date parentheses function. And I also have my GPS auto-populated using an iForm built-in function as well. Let me sync this real quick so I can download the changes. But I always like to throw in a little bit of extra into the forms just to show people some of the configurations that can be done that they may not be aware of. So as this downloads, go ahead and open the form again. Okay, cool. So you see that full name here now, taken from these two fields. And then these are all defaulted for a building name. I can enter in something here. I'll go into the rooms and we'll say B102. The floor is going to be basement. And the description is going to be a standard classroom. And we'll want to log some of the issues that we see while we're here. Now, the issues themselves, not the highlight of the webinar. The important part here is to actually look at that job number, and you'll see we're pulling values from that top level, from that parent level, and then that 0 is actually the index of the issues that I have. So let's go ahead and put some information in here. Whiteboard markers are missing. Corrective action, buy more markers. We'll skip the pictures. Let's go ahead and add another issue. And you'll see that the index is now incrementing. And so that's going to give me that unique job ID. What could be the next thing? We'll say not enough desks. Move desks from B105. Okay. But just a real quick, simple form. Again, what's fleshed out within the form is not the important takeaway here. What's really important is just demonstrating how to use these references. Because they are relative, it can be a little bit hard to conceptualize what the form is supposed to look like. But after 5-10 minutes of trying a few of them out, you'll find it's actually very, very intuitive. So one other thing I wanted to mention, or at least just to show, is what these references would have looked like if we chose not to use SPT. For anyone who is either considering the iForm platform or is kind of brand new, you may not have enough experience to have worked with the full form path in the past. But for those of us who have been with Zerion for a while and who have been building forms for years, I'm sure that you've had to go through using full form path references before. And so I wanted to show kind of the before and after, the contrast in complexity and length of the references. So over here we have our SPT based reference, again, self.firstname with the blank space, self.lastname. Using the full form path, this is what it would have looked like. Not too big of a difference, but again, that's primarily because the elements are on the parent level. If we go down to the next one though, the job number, we can see a stark contrast between the SPT version and the full form path version. And what I'll do is I'll use some highlighting to show you where each of the references are. So we'll start here with building inspection.building. That is the reference for top.building. Topmost level, use the parent form, and then the element name is building. The next reference goes to here, which is going to be building inspection dot. We have our subform element rooms, and then we have to specify the dynamic index by using the full form path as well. Within that subform, the element we're looking at is rooms. And that whole orange reference is replaced with parent.room. And then finally, to do the actual index, we would use all of this, which is building inspection.rooms, similar. In the square brackets, we have the same index reference. But then from here, what we want to do is look at the issues subform and pull the current index. And so this blue reference is replaced by parent.issues.index. And if you notice, this last part, issues.index, is the same between the two. So effectively, all of this here, which I will highlight in red, is replaced with simply one word, parent. And so that's really the beauty of SPT, kind of articulated an example. I do have, I have to mention, a couple of recommendations to kind of conclude the webinar, but before I do that, we did have a couple of polls that we wanted to launch, and then Barrett, while we launch those polls, also a good opportunity to maybe answer any other questions that have come up during the demo.
All right, so I just launched a poll. We've had a few questions actually come through. So while everyone is voting on this first question, on this first poll, there's a question that says, what is the difference between the index and the unique ID? We have been using unique ID, but that jumps the numbering in increments of 3 instead of using consecutive numbers.
Really good question. So unique ID is tied to the record ID, which is assigned by the server. So whenever you whenever you create a record, it's assigned an ID from within the table that it belongs to. As the attendee mentioned, those IDs do increment by 3. And so you'll have, IDs of 1, 4, 7, etc. What we used, which is the index, is the position in line for only this one record. Right? And so if you have a form, the unique ID is going to continue to go up and up and up, but that's across all records that are submitted. With the index, it's in a relative scope. So let's say I submit this record with 2 issues for Robinson B107. I don't remember which number I used. It has an index of 0 and a 1. If I go back to that same location, in the spring, and I say Robinson B107, the index would start again at 0 for within the scope of that one visit or within the scope of that one record. So as we talk through this, that does highlight a potential limitation of what we implemented, which is that the unique ID for the job, the job number, I'll say, I don't want to get the terminology mixed up. The job number would need some additional information to be truly always unique. Probably a timestamp is what I would recommend. But for the purposes of kind of a pared down demonstration on the webinar, we were using the index to increment that last portion.
Great, thank you, John. And I'll let you know if there's any other questions on that. The next question that came up is, in the event that you have 4 levels, would you still need to use the form name for one of them?
Yeah, really good question. Sneaky question. The answer is yes. So in the event you have 4 levels within your form, actually, I'm going to pause for a second because maybe not, but I'm going to start with the answer of yes. So if you have a form, parent, child, grandchild, great-grandchild, and you're on that bottom level, and you need to reference all 4 of the spots, top will get you at the top, self is yourself, and then parent is 1 level up. But we're missing that original subform, which is the second layer down. And so that is why I said, yes, you would still need to use the full form path in order to reference that. However, as I think through this, you would actually be able to reference that second layer by using top dot the subform element name. You still have to do your dynamic indexes, so it's a little bit of a hybrid, and then the element. So I would say in spirit, you would still have to use the full form path, but you would be able to build the reference in a way where technically you're using SPT only still.
Great, thank you. And again, I'll let you know if there's any follow-up questions on that one. And for now, let's close this one poll, and I'm going to launch our last poll. So if everyone could take a minute and respond to this, and once you respond to this question, if you have more follow-up questions, feel free to add them, and I'll bring them up to John. So this question is, do you plan on revising old forms to use SPT? And it looks like so far, and I'll share the results in just a minute, that no one has said no. So that is a good sign to see.
That's a good sign. That's awesome.
So I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results. Okay. So it seems that as if most people are going to try to slowly do it. So they're going to start with some of them.
That makes sense. That's perfect. That's kind of what we're hoping for, what we expected. And then the one other thing I'll say is, as you're going through that process, please share your experiences with us. I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar that this is a new feature. We can't even recommend full best practices at this point, but we want to be able to learn from everyone's experiences. We want to be able to evolve with you all. And so if you can share those with us, we'll make sure that we integrate them in our decision making and where we take this in the future.
Okay, so with that, John, I think we're getting to the end here. Would you like to do the following slides?
Yeah, I'll just do the best practices real briefly here, or recommended practices. I spent the whole webinar making sure not to call them best practices. The first one is not necessarily a recommended practice, but almost a bit of a disclaimer. I just want to make sure that everyone is aware of this. Currently, SPT is not supported on web forms. It is only on iOS and Android. Again, we did this because we wanted a more gradual rollout so that groups can learn how to use them. We can incorporate feedback, and if changes needed to be made or pivots needed to be made, we're able to do that. But as you're testing this out, they will not work on web forms currently. The next recommended practice here is to ensure all of your users have the correct app version. As I mentioned, you have to make sure that you're on the most recent app version on either iOS or Android. So it's important to either have all of your end users update their apps, or if you have a white label, request a new white label version so that you can ensure that all of your users have that updated app version and have support for SPT. The third recommended practice here is to practice in a sandbox environment if you have one available on your subscription. We feel like the references are going to be pretty easy to implement, especially on a new form. That being said, updating an existing form, I understand, can be a little bit more challenging because you have to almost untangle a lot of those longer references. And so I would recommend practicing in a sandbox environment, especially if it's the first time you're using SPT, just to get a feel for it. And then once you have that, still in a sandbox environment, try it out on some of your production forms, test them out in the sandbox. And then once you know that they're good, you can make those changes on the production side. The next recommended practice I have for everyone is to start with replacing the standalone references. Start with replacing with the full form references, full form path. And that might seem counterintuitive because the full form path references are already there. They're more complex, but they're stable. But I recommend starting with them for one reason and one reason only, and that is because we can guarantee that the outcome of the full form path is the same as the outcome of SPT. And so because you know what to expect, it will make testing much easier, and you'll have a higher level of confidence as you test through your forms. You'll be able to make a change and test it real quick, and your form should behave the same. Once your full form path references are completed, then I recommend to move on to the standalone references. And the reason I place these second is because this is actually a two-step process. You're going to want to replace the standalone references with SPT, but then you also need to make sure you do the process of going through and removing some of those cache busting dynamic values, because you don't want to, or they're not needed in there anymore. And so because of that two-step process, I recommend starting with the full form path variables, but also I would encourage groups not to stop at that point. In order to have that reliable data, to avoid caching, those standalone references are important to address. In the spirit of learning something new, I would start with the aspect where we know we get repeatable results though. And then the last two things here are not to forget your dynamic attributes. If any of you use the table view for your form building, like I do all the time, I choose dynamic value, I choose condition value, and then I go for it. And it covers almost all my references normally. But things like dynamic label, things like client validation, you can still see in that table. Dynamic attributes, you will have to be in the device view and make sure you click on that element to be able to see. Some of the dynamic attributes I have in mind specifically are things like the lookup filter for the lookup element. That was one of the things that I missed quite a bit when we were practicing and I was going through and changing old forms. So don't forget those dynamic attributes. And then the last recommended practice I have, once you have SPT and you've implemented it, you're comfortable with it, I would recommend groups start to implement what we call starter forms or template forms. now that you have that portability and the modularity. It will increase your form building consistency. It'll help you train and onboard new form builders as well, and be able to have a higher guarantee of repeatable, reliable outcomes and standard best practices within your own organization, whatever that may look like. And so with that, Barrett, those were the recommended practices I had. That was the information I had to present on SPT. I'll answer any other final questions, and otherwise, if you want to go through the announcements, I'm good on my end.
All right, so we don't have any more questions as of right this second. So let's go ahead and talk through some of our announcements.
Cool.
So our next webinar is on understanding iForm data structures as JSON. It's December 13th. We will have an email going out about that. Also, the follow-up email that was sent after this webinar recording and resources are available will have the links to sign up. We have our Zerion Academy has our new user orientation. It's not just for new users, it's for anyone who wants a refresher course or never felt like they fully understood all that the platform could do. So we do have these asynchronous courses available in Zerion Academy. They're free to everybody. And in the next slide, in just a minute, you'll see the steps on how to access those. Additionally, I am taking any of the Form Builder webinars that we have and placing it in those courses and all the materials there. So not only are you getting content on how to manage the data, manage users, and do form assignments, but you're also getting information about the latest releases that we have within form building. And lastly, we are going to be announcing our 2024 conference date. So we had an awesome Zerion Reimagined event this past September. Thank you if you were able to attend. We are already in the process of planning the next year's event. And so for those of you who joined last year or this year and want to come next year, definitely pay attention for the save the dates. And for those of you who wanted to come and couldn't, hopefully you can in 2024. And with that, I just want to thank you all for attending today and John for presenting. There was great questions coming in, so I appreciate everyone's effort. And thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.